Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Our afternoon session will start in 1 minute. And can I invite all of you to move to the middle and then move to the front so that we can hear more about, see more and hear more from the podium. Thank you. Sure, why not? I'll do that. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the afternoon session on addressing the SDGs by investing in private markets. Please join me welcome our speakers of the day, our moderator, Mr. An Li, our panelist, Mr. Ali Zakri Alias, our panelist, Ms. Huaifeng Chu, and our panelist, Mr. Stephen Lee. Please give them a round of applause.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see all of you here. It's really wonderful to be back in KL, and I'm sure all of you enjoyed reconnecting with old friends, colleagues, and partners. I'm privileged to really moderate this session here today in my capacity as AVPN board member. In my day job, I lead the Sustainable Impact Investments for LGT, and I'm really, really honored to be among friends, but also esteemed investors in the impact sector. Okay, as you mentioned, I'm really joined by Tunku Ali Zakri from MavCap, formerly CEO of EPF. I have Huaifeng Chu, who's the regional lead for private equity funds for IFC, and I have Stephen Lee, who's the senior director and head of Asia for Nuveen. And this session that brings us all together today is really talking about the role of private market investments and how we can sort of drive SDG outcomes and impact at the same time. Now, I wanted to start off by giving a little bit of context that for the other sessions that you've heard yesterday and even today, Naina and others talk about the continuum of capital. A lot of the sessions talk about concessionary and philanthropic capital. This session is trying to bring in private capital, in particular private equity. And private equity, I always start off by saying it's a very, very powerful way to drive change, because unlike other forms of investments, they have an active ownership, right? So you're taking actual ownership in companies. Along with that ownership, you have governance and informational rights, and you use those rights in a way to do value creation with each of these companies. And it's really through that value creation that you can actually drive outcomes, both on the societal and the environmental side, and therefore contribute to the SDGs. Now, it's really in that context that I thought I'd ask my panelists to a bit of a framing question, which is, what is the landscape for impact investing in private markets? Can you share with us a little bit about your strategies and how you allocate your portfolio? Now, I'm going to start with Zakri. I'm very, very happy to be reunited with Zakri because 5 years ago, when you were still leading EPF, you invited me here to KL to speak about impact investing, and it was very, very rare for an institutional investor like an EPF to really take the lead in sustainable impact investing. So we'd love to start a little bit with your journey.
Sure. So thank you so much. Maybe I could actually share with the audience also the thinking and the mindset from an institutional investor and why we would actually look into impact investing. So as you mentioned, I was the CEO of EPF, and just to give context, EPF is during my time was the 7th largest provident fund in the world with an AUM of approximately $250 billion US. So we actually saw the need for us to go into what we then called sustainable investments all the way back to 2015, because we actually started seeing the developments of risk happening in the whole capital markets. The first part was the VUCA world, right? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and Ambiguous, thank you. I've been so long out of the corporate sector, I've forgotten what it meant. So, and we know with that it creates huge amounts of volatility, right? But for a provident fund, you can't have volatility because you are looking into the long term also. Of course, you can take advantages of the ups and downs in the markets, especially if you're into very liquid type of assets like equities, right? But as a whole, as a portfolio type, you need to look for very long term. So just to give you a bit of context, in the olden days, to go and give 1% of dividends for EPF, you only needed several hundred million. But by the time I was CEO, you needed approximately around, if I'm not mistaken, 9 billion in realized income for every 1% of dividends. And in the older days, people were getting like close to 8 to 9% per year. And by the time like it came to my time, we were just declaring 6%, and people were already saying, oh my God, you guys are useless, so on and so forth. So we needed to go and balance in terms of like insulating ourselves from too much of this VUCA world, but still retaining the mandate of building up their retirement fund. So that was the first part that we saw. The second thing that we also saw was the development of what our members wanted, okay? Of course, you know, all they care about is money, 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 money. But we were saying, taking into account the lowering financial dividends that was happening, we have to balance out also with the invisibles. You know, the type of invisible dividends that our investments actually brought to the country. For example, the money that we put into infrastructure like roads has created one of the best connected systems in the world, I would say, in terms of transportation. And that in itself brings about innovation, productivity increase, and all that. But that's not quantified. Our investments into the healthcare sector also, right? It's not quantified that because we actually put a lot of money, the quality of healthcare goes up, and also the amounts of, the cost of it starts to come down a bit. Now, but the big problem was we were never able to quantify the invisible dividends to actually convince our members that even though you get 6% returns in financial returns, but you are compensated by this, for lack of better word, in inverted commas, social dividends. So that was the next challenge. We also saw the development of the demographics. Younger and younger members were now, you know, it's becoming, last time there used to be a pyramid, right? But now it's becoming like inverted pyramid, where we were getting more and more younger members into our member pool. And we know young people now, they are very woke, right? They are not only satisfied with I get money, but they want to know where am I getting it from and how am I getting it. And we saw what was happening, especially in Europe, where these big provident funds were being sued by 20-year-olds. And they had locus standi to actually have a legal case, and they were winning cases. They were winning cases. We also saw, for example, some developments where minority shareholders, they were weaponizing ESG, right? I think we saw during my time, it was the Exxon board, I think, where they removed one of the board members because they were saying that, you know, you don't have enough people in the sustainability side for oil and gas. So we foresaw all that. So we were very proud that we worked from 2015 with that sort of thinking and convincing our board. Can you give me one more minute to share maybe with you on how we managed to convince them? So one thing that we've learned is that when you're trying to convince people, the numbers, you can show as much numbers as you want, but to them, it's just a given. What worked best was when we actually told stories. And I remember when I was presenting it to the board to convince them that we needed to go into impact and sustainable investing, was we printed up a map of where our branches were, because we have 66 branches throughout Malaysia. And we focused it into Selangor, okay, which is one of the states in Malaysia. And with that picture, we said, now we are all here, but within, by 2030, 3 of those branches would be underwater, 2 of it would be next to the beach. You know, and the minute when they saw that, you know, a picture speaks 1,000 words, my work was done. You know, they just went, yeah. But the challenge is, which we will talk later on, is to convince the members, because they're not interested in all of that. All they want is money.
So interesting though. So I want to sort of highlight a key point there, you know, as we talked about the shifting mindset of capitalism, this idea behind the societal dividend, right? This thing that everyone in your stakeholders needs to be enriched, because too much of capitalism has always looked at one stakeholder, which is your shareholder, right? So I just want to hold that thought for a moment. Now I'm going to move on to Huai Feng, who has had a very illustrious career working for leading DFIs, development finance institutions, from DEG to now IFC. And I want to really bring in Huai Feng to this conversation to share the regional perspectives and private equity from the point of view of investing in funds, but also direct equity investments as well. Huai Feng.
Thank you. And so hi, everyone. My name is Huai Feng. I head up the private equity funds team for East Asia for the IFC. The IFC, if you guys are not familiar with, we are the private investment arm of the World Bank Group, and we are also one of the largest impact investors of private equity funds globally. So this is something that's really very close to our hearts. Having worked for a lot of development finance institutions and seen the evolution of impact investing over the years, I do think that this is definitely gaining a lot of traction. Specific to Asia, though, is still lagging a little bit behind those emerging regions that we also focus on, for instance, in Africa. I think there was a panel earlier this morning on blended finance, and someone highlighted that blended finance in Asia is actually declining. It's first already the lowest across all regions in Asia, and it's also declining over the years. So it does seem like this is not actually gaining a lot of traction in Asia. But in terms of private equity funds, which I focus on, I do think that that form of knowledge and about impact investing is actually gaining a lot of traction with fund managers. So we are no longer investing on our own in private equity funds. We do have a lot of like-minded investors, such as like Nuveen and a lot of other foundations which we partner with to be looking at investing in private equity funds that has an impact mandate. Obviously, impact investing differs even within the region. So in South Asia, we see a lot more traction there. I think it's also got to do with the size of the market. In Southeast Asia, where we are all sitting in and where a lot of action is actually needed, is still relatively underserved. And the reasons we can go on to talk about later. But definitely, the call to action is really we need to do more in this space. And it starts from everyone and today. Yeah.
Thank you, Huai Feng. I want to move to Stephen now. I actually met Stephen probably about almost a year ago now when he moved to Singapore. And I want to bring in Stephen because he works for Nuveen. And Nuveen's a very large global investment manager. And I want to get Stephen to share a little bit of his role sort of working with Nuveen, where they cover a lot of different assets. But Stephen's job focuses on private equity and just recently moved to Singapore a year ago. So welcome.
Thank you. And yeah, just happy to maybe share a little bit of the story of Nuveen and our parent company, TIAA, which I think should give you some context in terms of why our organization is so committed to impact in everything that we do. And so maybe I'll just start with Nuveen at the organization that I work with. We're a global asset manager. It's sort of a US-based organization, but have offices all over the world and many offices across Asia. Nuveen manages $1.1, $1.2 trillion globally. And as you can imagine, that goes across many different asset classes, et cetera. A lot on the public market side, as you could imagine, but also a significant portion on the private market side as well. And as Oda was mentioning, I work in the private equity impact investing team. So everything that we do we're doing growth equity in companies, and everything that we're doing is with impact. But I'm part of a larger organization that is also doing, other groups are also doing impact investing. So I can give you some examples. We have a green infrastructure team called Glenmont, who they invest in solar and renewable energy projects. We have a Nuveen Natural Capital, which is an affiliate that does a lot of work in sustainable agriculture and forestry. Our real estate team is a top 5 real estate team in the world, and also happens to be one of the largest investors in affordable housing preservation in the US. And even on the public market side, I know this is about private markets, but on the public market side, we have a team that invests in bonds, that either some green bonds, sub bonds, also investing in community or social impact, which is really a public markets fixed income fund product that retail investors can invest in. So across the spectrum, when you look at Nuveen and the different asset classes, there are other groups doing impact. I happen to sit on the private equity side, and just a little bit of what we do. We invest globally in growth companies, so we're really looking for companies that have some early level of scale that's really looking to take it to that next level. And we invest both on the social impact side as well as the climate impact. And really like our journey, maybe just a little bit quickly on our journey as a team. I think initially we started off as really a funds focused program. So we a lot of our early investments, really going back more than 10 years now, was in a lot of funds. But over time, we've evolved to really be much more of a direct focused team, and we still have a fund of funds program. But that's just quickly about our journey as a team.
No, thank you. So I think you sort of take some of the key takeaways from this question. You can see that the landscape is evolving, right? And one of the things why I really have to thank AVPN and the YH team for putting a special day for impact is because a lot of the time when we speak about these conferences, we talk about philanthropic concessionary capital. This is a panel that shows you that institutional capital is moving this direction. And all the time that we talk about the urgency and the scale of the solution, the money is kept with the institutions. And this is a very, very important dynamic that I hope all of us can sort of be conscious about today. Now, I want to move to the next question, which really builds on the first one, which is that, obviously there's so many compelling reasons why impact investing and sustainable investing come in. Zaki mentioned it's about risk mitigation. Huaifeng mentions about identifying new opportunities, innovations. Stephen mentioned a little bit about the way that people are thinking about across whole asset classes, across different asset classes, right? And obviously we all see what's happening in the public markets, which also highlights why the private markets becomes very interesting, particularly in a place like Asia. But I want to start off with where are the constraints? Where are the challenges to getting more money in Asia? And are there some complexities that you see in this region that maybe other regions don't have? Maybe I start off with you, Huaifeng, because you've been looking at the space for a while.
Thanks, and yeah, I mean, it's indeed very challenging to be drawing capital to this region, and that's also the mandate of the IFC. We want to mobilize private capital into the investments that we do, so we don't want to be the sole person, sole ranger into these investments. But I focus on funds, private equity funds in Southeast Asia in particular. Across the broader Southeast Asia private equity funds, not talking about impact, fundraising has already been relatively challenging, just because it's such a small region compared to all the other, more exciting markets, developed markets where returns are more stable, the risks are lower. Southeast Asia is already unique in that, being very heterogeneous, right? Where, you look at it as one ASEAN, but at the same time, it's actually quite different if you look underneath the hood. At the same time, FX risks also exist. And that's already just generally across on the commercial private equity side. Impact investing takes it another level higher, or more difficult actually, because we first don't have a very strong track record of impact funds investing in this part of the world that has done well and has done a family of funds, right? And so if the returns don't show, then it's difficult to mobilize private capital. So there is also this whole argument on, whether blended finance should come in, whether this should be more, a political thing where governments put in more money and subsidize all these returns. But if you want this to be sustainable and we want impact investing to be an asset class that can hold, that can stand on its own, it can't be subsidized for forever. We do need it to be commercially viable and sustainable on its own for the long run. So I think that's the key challenge that this part of the world is facing for impact investing, is that there's so far a lack of positive track record. Yeah.
No, thank you, Huaifeng. No, I think that's a very realistic snapshot. And obviously, Huaifeng sharing her view, investing into a lot of funds, right? Private equity funds. Stephen, I want to go to you. And what is it like as a GP going into direct deals? Because I want to continue that equation.
Sure. I guess maybe one challenge I would highlight would be, and maybe this all depends on your perspective and what you consider large or small, but I think if you are really looking to deploy large amounts of capital in private equity, I think, I would say you may run into some challenges. Now, there are investors out there that are deploying $100 million, sometimes $200 million in a single deal. They are out there, those deals are happening, but I would say that that's still kind of few and far between in the market. I would say, my sense is at earlier stages, of companies, the market is quite vibrant, both in Southeast Asia and Southeast Asia and South Asia. I'll maybe comment on those two regions because those are the ones I follow. But obviously we're seeing over time the markets, what was sort of really deep on the early stage is now becoming deeper now in kind of the growth stage, and sort of that's relevant for me as a growth stage investor to seeing how many are these early stage deals coming up where I can deploy potentially 20, 30, $40 million in a transaction. So I think some of that, waiting for kind of that full depth of the market to show through, I think will still take some time, but more and more you are seeing headline deals of these large deals here and there, and you're seeing kind of much more, at least to me, from my perspective on a day-to-day basis, seeing much more on the growth stage than we did even a few years ago, which I think is, which is part of that natural evolution and maturation of the market.
That's very interesting. So we've talked a little bit about what you see at the fund level, what you see at direct level. Now I'm going to bring it home to you, Zachary, because I'm going to bring it home literally to Malaysia.
Literally.
Obviously, as the chairman of MavCap, which is, I understand, the largest venture funds of funds in Malaysia, can you share with us a little bit what you're seeing in Malaysia?
Okay.
Because you form a very important role, because you're priming the early stage breakthrough innovations that hopefully Stephen and others can invest in, LGT as well, and then eventually it goes to funds, right? Because funds, the GPs need to have these exciting opportunities. That's how you build the continuum of capital flowing down.
Yep.
So what's happening?
So I'm going to draw up into more of the macroeconomic level, and I'm going to say some things that is going to get me into trouble in Malaysia. So hopefully I'll still be able to come tomorrow. But I'm known to talk my mouth off, no filters. So I think the first challenge that we actually face at a macroeconomic level, at least from my part of the world, is there is the lack of understanding of what impact is all about. Because if you look at the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, from an esoteric perspective, they look at impact outcomes and impact returns at the highest level of the Maslow. Whereas for a lot of markets in our part of the world, we haven't even got the first two levels, which is your basic requirements, which in Malaysia, by the way, from a social security angle, which you call shelter, health, income security, nutrition, education, mobility, and technology gap, is very lacking. Okay, so if you can't even handle basic things like that, I mean, despite what you see in this glittering capital of Kuala Lumpur, it's a very different story where if you go outside. What more do you want to talk about saving the animals or whatever? I can still remember, when we were talking about some people on the ground, they're like saying, why should I care about where that money is going to go and save children in Bangladesh, for example, when my own kid needs food? So why are you looking at that, right? So that's one basic thinking that is missing. The second thing also is this rise of populism and also the rise of instability. In Malaysia alone, over the past 5 years, we've had, Malaysians help me, is it 4 or 5 different prime ministers, So we've had more prime ministers change in such a short time. And you can imagine the impact from a policy-making perspective. So for politicians at this point of time, they are literally counting months in terms of how long they might have in a position of power. So when you want to talk about impact, which literally we know that returns will take, on average of 7 to 9 years, right, for impact investing, or at least sustainable investing. In politician land, that is eternity. I want results, I want it now, and I want things to be able to show back to the people on the ground that I'm making an impact. And that has actually happened in Malaysia with some irresponsible politicians who literally vandalize the social security infrastructure for their own political gains. So that is a very difficult perspective if you're from an institutional investor trying to convince the powers that be that this is the direction to go, okay? However, I think we are seeing a lot of changes also in Malaysia. The awakening is already happening, so that's good. Let me see, in terms of misalignment, and of course, like what I had mentioned earlier about making the intangible tangible, right? I can still remember I was in a company which was looking into investing into into a country in ASEAN which has some questionable human rights records, but the profit returns would have been very handsome. So I had to raise it to them at the board at that point of time, because they were like, it was purely financial, right? So you said, at what cost is this money going to be on us? It will be a cost on our soul at the end of the day. But then how do you quantify cost on soul? Now, lastly, another challenge that we are facing, which is actually a positive challenge, but it's still a challenge nonetheless, from Malaysia, is from a regulator side, actually, they're ahead of the game. Now, from what I have actually seen, they've come up with some pretty innovative and far-reaching policies already being put in place to impose sustainability and impact thinking into investments. But the big problem is the market is struggling to catch up. The SMEs, down on the ground, they are struggling to catch up. What more, they are just coming out of COVID, and now they have to start looking into transitions. Where are they going to get the cash from? Because you actually need to relook in terms of your entire business processes in order for you to be viable in this new economy. So regulators are out there, but whether we like it or not, because there's international regulations also coming into play, right? But what's going to happen to the local mums and pops on the ground or the smaller businesses on the ground? That's going to be another major challenge in this part of the world.
No, that's so interesting, though. I think this idea of the Maslow's needs, right? The truth is, if you look at the Maslow's pyramid, we don't often price based on the hierarchy. And for the longest time, societal outcomes, whether it's society, environment, has never been priced the same way other things have been priced, right? So sometimes we talk about it a little bit when it comes to carbon. For the longest time, if you consume carbon, you didn't have to pay, right? But now with carbon tax and the whole decarbonization net zero movement, you're starting to price that in, right? So that's changing. And I think obviously, Zachary, your point about Malaysian politics, I think it's gone through a bit of turbulence, but looking forward, I think the good thing about talking about impact and sustainability is really how does the future look, right? And I think to your point, sometimes the future, if you're looking at the public markets, is too short term, right? Whereas impact is by definition, or private equity is by definition, the nature of the fund, so it's 10, 12 years sometimes, right? So how do we sort of shift that mindset? Now I want to flip to a more positive question to see the flip side of the coin, which is, despite all these challenges, why do we think that Asia is such a compelling market? And in your respective roles, what are some of the examples you can share with us of successful investments that can scale? Stephen, should I start with you this time?
Sure. I mean, a couple things that I'd like to mention, and maybe I'll give a couple examples of investments that we've done recently that why we're kind of so excited about them. Really, a couple things that that I think why is Asia so compelling. I think one is the demographic story. This rising middle class customer in very large populations is, I think a significant opportunity both from a business standpoint and from an impact standpoint. Traditionally, this segment was smaller, historically smaller, but also more and more aspirational in the things that they want. They want the education for their kids, where they live, what house they live in, etc. So that this becomes both an opportunity for business and impact. And Asia really, houses 60% of the world's population. So you really couldn't find a more compelling region, in terms of that demographic story. Maybe one example, that a recent investment we've made is called Aviom Housing Finance, based in India. So they target a lower income segment of the market for a home mortgage. And it's really, I think they would describe it more like a home improvement loan. But essentially, they really target this, what they would call kind of a graduated microfinance buyer. So this family that has had maybe a couple cycles of microfinance loans, been successful at repayment. But that family too has other needs that a microfinance loan cannot meet. So housing, they want a home. They say they may have a plot of land that has no home. They want to build a home on that. It might be a more traditional, mud, bamboo style house. They want to build a proper brick house. So this company provides a home improvement loan so they can build that ground level of their house, and maybe over time build even a second level on their house. And it's a segment of the market that really very few, if not anyone else, is really targeting as their focus. But everything that they're doing is focused on this customer, on the ticket size that this customer needs, and really fitting the kind of the cash flows and the debt service that these families can really handle. And so we're really excited. We're really excited about the impact story here. There's a lot more to the story as well, in terms of every home that they finance has to have a working toilet, which I think we all take that for granted for the people in this room, but particularly for low-income women, not having to use the outhouse all the time can be very meaningful, on multiple levels. The company also is really it's run by a woman promoter who also is very passionate about women's empowerment, and so they actually use a network of women. A lot of these women who are microfinance clients are these women in these villages where microfinance loans have happened, and they use them as sourcing agents, so they pay them commission fees to source new mortgages for the company. So I think, like, from all these different angles, we're super excited from a business standpoint, but also from the impact story there. If maybe I could just name one other thing, really on the climate side. I think what we're really excited about climate, and maybe this is not specific only to Asia, but this is what I'm seeing this in Asia, is particularly when you're talking about some things like rooftop solar, even with the carbon credit markets now evolving to where they are today. We are seeing business models in climate today that the unit economics make sense. They're good business. So we're not talking about, oh, this is going to be great in 5 years. You're seeing these business models in the market today that you can invest in as an investor. I think that to me is really exciting. Just to tie this in also to one other investee we've done, we invest in a company in India called EcoZen. They make solar water pumps and solar micro cold storage units, really there to support smallholder farmers and to complement really that cold chain in agriculture. So really utilizing renewable energy technology to power these, so you don't need to be on the grid, as well as, particularly I think I'm excited about both products. But this micro cold storage unit in particular is a real innovation in the market, and that what they're already exporting it to other continents like Africa, for example. So really excited both on the climate impact that this business can have, but also how it's supporting smallholder farmers in India, and now around the world. And so it just kind of gives you an example of some of the things that are out there that we're excited about, that we're investing in.
No, thank you, Stephen. I want to sort of pick up on a couple of points there. So I think, when you look at impact, it's quite often people see this through sector lines, but the truth is when you're trying to alleviate poverty, you're dealing with multi-sectoral solutions, right? So to Stephen's last one, imagine if you're a agrarian-driven smallholder farmer, you're not just uplifting the productivity and yields and incomes of the farmers, you're giving them access to energy, right, which is affordable at solar rates, at the same time giving access to water. Right? So it's a little bit of that thinking when we suggest as an impact investor, you've got to sometimes think about the connections between the sectors and how they sort of engage. Huaifeng, I'm going to come to you because I know that you've also looked at some of the agri supply chains, and maybe I think you had an example in healthcare as well. That might be quite interesting for everyone.
Yeah, thanks. And actually, I fully agree with you that, in terms of impact, thinking about impact maybe is we don't need to actually segregate it according to sectors. It's actually a cross-cutting theme. Just like climate is also a cross-cutting theme, right? It could appear across sectors. With specific to examples that we have seen in IFC, and I'm talking about my more indirect portfolio. So, I mean, the reason we invest in funds is also we want those funds to be able to provide impact on a large scale and actually gap IFC's portfolio, right? While we focus on maybe other transactions which are probably a bit larger, our funds can take care of those that we have left out, right? So, you know, we try to mobilize capital and also leverage on our funds network. So some indirect portfolio of our funds include, for instance, in the healthcare space, genetics testing and diagnostics. Particularly in Vietnam, we have a diagnostics company which does non-invasive prenatal testing for the local community at a fraction of the cost compared to what you would have from international providers. That is actually very meaningful for the local community, right? Given, I mean, the demographics of Vietnam, 100 million population, not everyone can have access to paying $1,000 for prenatal testing. So that is very valuable to the community and the people they serve. On the agriculture side, given that, you know, Southeast Asia is also a very agrarian economy, we have also invested a lot in agri-tech. So, you know, products or companies which do farm to table, eliminating waste, creating more efficiencies by eliminating intermediaries on that front. That's also something that we are particularly focused on and have invested a lot in. Even on the non-tech side, I think access by the local communities is very important. So for instance, we have also invested in dairy companies that does import substitution. A dairy company in Cambodia, for instance. Cambodia gets all its milk from overseas sources. They don't have local producers of, you know, milk that they can drink on a daily basis, and they have to get, you know, frozen or imported milk from overseas, which is very costly. So we have also invested in companies which do this on land in Cambodia, you know, creating a brand, creating a local brand that people can identify with, also at a more fraction of the cost compared to importing milk from overseas. That gives also people on the ground access, and that in itself is also relatively impactful in our view.
So you can see that between Stephen and Huai Fong, you can see that there's a lot of opportunity to connect fragmented value chains, right? And I let Zaki continue this equation, because how do you connect fragmented value chains in emerging Asia? It's essentially through technology in order to democratize access to essential goods and services.
Okay, before I get into that, I need to say some things to save me from the Malaysian regulators. So I have to say nice things about Malaysia now, and why Malaysia is actually a great place for you to put your money in. Malaysia, from a nature-based solutions perspective, we actually represent 3% of the potential globally at this point of time. So there's huge opportunity here. I mean, but of course, you know, you can argue, sure, Malaysia is 3%, but we haven't talked about Indonesia and Thailand and Vietnam, right? So why Malaysia? Because, number one, despite what I mentioned earlier on about the instability of the politics, I would like to think in terms of the infrastructure at the governance and regulatory level is very stable. And as I had mentioned to you earlier on, the drive and the policy making is actually moving very, very fast. 1 year ago, you wouldn't be talking about the incorporation of TCFDs into our disclosure reports, right? But now, the Securities Commission and Bursa, which is our boss, are already putting in a timeline when it has to become mandatory, which is actually very advanced, right? So that's what this in terms of stability. Number two, in terms of cost. Okay, now I'm going to take a little dig at my neighbor, Singapore, which is, I mean, you know, you really have nice infrastructure there. But in terms of where this is such a nascent industry, do you really need to put your HQ in Singapore at this point of time? So Malaysia actually has that nice in-between, right? Between you have a pool of highly talented individuals, you have a pool of developing an investment pool for you to put into, and you have a stable environment for you to actually put your investments into action. So now if I drag myself out a bit further and look at the potential of ASEAN as a whole, So if you were to go and play, I should run for politics, right? You know, if you pull yourself out and if you actually think about attacking ASEAN as a whole, if it was me, of course I would say root for the home team, set up your base in Malaysia, but look at the opportunities throughout ASEAN, right? Because that's where the money really is. Once you've actually started, you use Malaysia also as a form of prototype in terms of some of your thinking and some of your frameworks before you can actually push it out. And then use that once it's developed to a certain level, Singapore is the perfect launching pad into the world. And from a VC perspective, that's what we saw for Grab, right? We started out in Malaysia but ended up in Singapore. So rather than look at it's a grab for all, and you know it's a binary win or lose, you must look at ASEAN as a whole. So if you actually have that framework, suddenly it really makes sense because ASEAN has like what, close to 700 million in terms of population also, and we have that drive. And you know why? Because things don't work in this part of the world, right? Okay, and maybe I'm overreaching. I'll focus back to Malaysia so that the Indonesians don't come after me. But as I mentioned to you earlier on, Malaysia's social security infrastructure is not really up there. But you guys who are investors, you know you make money out of adversity, isn't it? One case in point. In Malaysia, MAVCAP actually has invested into Aerodyne. Aerodyne is a drone company which is now, if I'm not mistaken, the second largest in the world, if I'm not mistaken, right? Started out like a hobby sort of thing, and now they're the second largest in the world based out of Malaysia. And their incorporation, so coming to your point about incorporation of technology with social needs. In Malaysia, surprisingly, we are one of the most urbanized countries in the world with close to 82% of our population actually in urban areas. So remember I talked to you about also social security, it's about income. And the cost of living in Kuala Lumpur itself is no way, you know, in terms of what we are getting in terms of the income levels. So the only way that we can actually do is for them to go back. Now, when I talk about Aerodyne, in the plantations industry, there was this huge pushback in terms of foreign labor because we were addicted to foreign labor. But when COVID happened, foreign labor was cut down, so we were forced to go into automation. And guess what? We used drones to actually look to, at our fields on fertilizer and all that. All of a sudden, we saw a reverse movement of population of young people from the urban back to the rural areas. Why? Because they were now called drone operators. Sexy, you know, it's like a sexy term. And all of a sudden, the Malays, actually Malays, we love the countryside. But when you couple it with technology and a sexy term, all of a sudden, it's okay to go back to the kampongs, to the villages, because I'm a drone operator. So this was where you found out that investments into technology, incorporation into real-life issues with business mandates, and also doing it in clever ways of branding and positioning, all of a sudden, it all has this massive economic, financial, and social impact.
That's very exciting. I've been watching Aerodyne's expansion as well. It's super exciting, right? So I really take the point that, you know, I think we all agree that as a market, you need to target Asia, right? It's not one country. The ASEAN countries, the 10 of them with the 700 million population, GDP, I think 7th largest GDP in the world collectively, right? It becomes a very interesting total addressable market for all our innovations. I want to sort of move us to sort of the last question. I'm seeing the time check over there. Before I open for questions for all of you and can keep this conversation interactive, is I'm sure some of you in the audience are either existing impact investors or aspiring impact investors. So if there's one piece of advice that you give our audience here today, you know, what would that be? And name me one thing, one area, one theme, one innovation, one solution that excites you. Okay? While you're thinking about it, maybe I throw over to Stephen first.
Sure. You know, I think you know, for advice, you know, I would just say, you know, and maybe I'll tie it also. I mean, I'll come back to kind of what I said earlier in terms of what I'm excited about. I think climate in particular, because I mean, I think if you're objective about it, maybe Asia might be or Southeast Asia may be a couple steps behind some other regions of the world in terms of their kind of climate, the climate activity. But I see sort of this surge of activity that's happening, particularly at early stages of companies, really nascent business models that look very promising, where the unit economics are there today. I think there's just some time for some of these projects to come online. And so I think the climate space, I think tracking the climate space in Asia, I think will be very interesting. And I think we'll see a lot of innovation and a lot of changes in the next few years. I think that's one area I'm very excited about. And I think really just in terms of advice, I don't really have too much. I would just say, just keep your ear on the ground, keep following what's happening, keep tracking these companies that are popping up at an early stage, because these are the next growth stage companies, which are going to be the next unicorns, and the pace of activity and the pace of change that is happening in Asia is so rapid right now that I think it's just keep your eyes and ears on the ground and go along for the ride. So,
Stephen, so you're a direct investor. If there's some people in our audience that are trying to raise capital for impact investors, what advice would you give them?
Great question. I think one of the things, one of the trends that I guess maybe a little bit early to say for sure, but I think what is a trend that I'm seeing on the fundraising side is really a lot of the younger generation, so that has money. There is a significant amount of enthusiasm for impact investing. From that generation, like maybe there's some obviously at the older generations as well, but particularly as the younger generations are starting to take over either their family offices or looking after kind of the financial futures of their families, I see a lot of significant enthusiasm and desire to be involved in impact investing, and so I would say that may be an interesting trend to follow over time.
Hui Fong, what about if people in the audience are trying to raise a private equity or impact fund? What advice would you give them?
So I think, impact funds come to us and they are usually very passionate about the causes, right? And they want to do work immediately. They know that there is a $1 trillion gap and then they want to do it. They want to just go straight in. My advice would be for you to think about the sustainability of your own fund, that you build it out as a long-lasting program, that it's not a one-hit fund, one-time fund, right? So you have to make sure that the investments that you make are thoughtfully crafted, and that would make it would help do the asset class proud as well, right? And not just hit straight in. I think it's the same for companies. Entrepreneurs are so passionate about their idea. They might have a great idea, but the key is in terms of the execution. So I think it's the same for private equity fund managers.
Zachary, I'm sure there's some unicorns potentially in the audience.
I'm quite sure of it.
What advice?
Yeah, okay. For me, yes, I come across as very much into the social security space and also into environment. In fact, I'm in the process, involved in the process of setting up tiger conservation in Pahang, which is around going to be 130,000 hectares, which is twice the size of Singapore. We're in the process of that. But the one thing that I always get irritated about is when people talk about impact investing and they translate it into something fuzzy-wuzzy. It's nice to have. Now, this is where my ultra-capitalism hat Sunday comes on. Because I'm not saying, I'm not interested in you doing CSR. By the way, that is the three that really irritates me when you use the word CSR. Because it has to go back to the mandate of why you set up a business. It's to make money. And if you want to make money, I am convinced that impact investing can give you superior returns. And on top of that, I am willing to give you a longer time frame in order for you to achieve your promised returns. But don't tell me that there's no money involved. So if ever you're going to do a pitch, if ever you're going to come to MAVCAP, for example, for money, the first thing you need to show is, where's the returns? I do demand my returns, but I am much more forgiving in how you actually structure your timing and the impact of beyond remember we talked about financial dividends as well as that social dividends. So I'm also, if you can show the social dividends, I'm also much more forgiving in that sense.
No, I think that's a very key point. I think as the sector evolves and it gets more sophisticated, for impact investments, you have to show that the positive societal and environmental outcomes mutually reinforce the operational and financial scale of the business. Okay, that's very important.
But Andy, can I just add to that? You know, I think the one advantage of a company going to a state or a country-backed fund is that they are much more forgiving towards the societal returns, because that is the growth mandate of like the math caps of the world. You know, as opposed to, not to knock you guys down, right? But for when you come to a state fund, if you can show that part, actually they become even more excited, because that is something you can report back up to the politicians, which then can go into their political rhetoric of creating jobs and whatever not, you know. So that's my one other little tip also.
Sure. And I also think that that same philosophy extends to definitely IFC, right? Development Finance Institutions. And we were just talking over lunch that Naveen, when they came out of TIAA, came out of the teachers' pensions or endowment. So in a way, they all had the societal aspect in their DNA, which is something that's very important. Now, I'm just looking at some of the questions that are coming through. I'm probably in the remaining minutes might choose maybe one or two. I'll choose this one because I think it quite often comes up in panels, which is, how do you deal with all these risks of impact or greenwashing? And just for the audience to understand, what this means is, now that sustainably impact investing ESG is going through a bit of a hype, everyone claims to drive impact, right? And sometimes when you drive that impact in a way that which is false or unsubstantiated, that's called impact washing or greenwashing when it relates to environment. So how do you prevent that risk?
Can
Sure.
I try to I always go back to show it to me from your existing business processes. If it's got nothing to do your business, to me, it's fake, you know? So whether you want to go and put a circular economy type of hat on, or you want to go into societal hat on, tell me how it links directly back to your business. If you're in an airline industry, don't suddenly tell me you're going to go and start teaching rural children. Okay, that doesn't make sense to me. But if you're going to talk to me about SAFs, for example, all of a sudden I'm excited because it makes sense, right? So to me, that is my one filter that I actually use before I call your bluff.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, when you look at the impact investing industry today, there are many industry standards and taxonomies that are out there. You know, whether you talk about IRIS Plus, or you're talking about the impact management project that IFC had started, SFDR in Europe. I can go on and on. There are many different industry taxonomies, standards, whether it be how you go about your incorporating impact in all your processes, et cetera. And if you as an impact investor are not engaging with these standards, then I would say you are at risk of being of greenwashing. Because these standards are out there, they're public. They are setting the bar of what it means to be an impact investor. So if you are not engaging with these, I would highly encourage you to do so, because this is going to, and the industry will continue to push the envelope over time. But if you are not getting on that train now, then you are at risk of being of greenwashing.
Can I poke back?
Sure.
Stephen, if you don't mind. Sure. Because we have to make sure that these international standards must be contextualized to the local environment,
absolutely,
right? I mean, a real example of this is where I get very worried about the growth of sustainability practice policies coming up, because sometimes I see it's a reverse form of colonization happening, and also in terms of weaponization of ESG. Case in point, I was in a oil palm plantations company, which was being accused of slave labor conditions. And they used ILO standards. And one of the standards which they used at international level was in terms of water, okay? And they were saying that every person at the plantations must have the same level of water as the same household in America. And that was the standard that they were imposing on Malaysia. which to me I was very upset about. So we have to be a bit careful, and I think if we in developing countries, we need to stand up and we need to go and have a say, and we need to have a place at that table to go and contextualize these global standards which make sense to us.
No, and I would fully agree with everything you said, and there are, I wouldn't say some of these taxonomies are perfect, right? But
It's a guide.
but it's a starting point. It's a guide. If you're not interacting with it, if you don't have a point of view on it, then I think that's where the issue is, right?
Yes.
It's okay to not follow every single. I mean, there's a lot out there. it's you don't have to necessarily follow every single one and be follow every single metric out there, but you need to be interacting with them at some level.
I think it sets a common baseline, right? So I think we're getting to the stage that everyone talks about the alphabet soup of these acronyms, right? We are getting to some form of industry convergence, right? And I think the point you made was just a right one. Just because it works in Europe or US doesn't mean it can be contextualized in Asia. I think that's really the point. So I'm conscious of time. I'm seeing the red card go up in terms of our time's up. So Huai Feng, I just want to give you the last word. Anything to add on this last point? Because I know IFC has really been pushing the operating principles for impact measurement.
Yeah, no, thanks for the pitch on that. Yeah, definitely. I think we came up with the OPIM operating principles of impact management a few years back, just to also address this greenwashing issue. For us, impact funds means they do three things. They need to have the intention to do impact, they need to measure it, and they need to report it. So yeah, that's my last.
And ultimately, you're trying to look for authenticity and transparency, right? So I think I probably end with that. And it's very, very rare to have an esteemed panel of institutional investors here with us today to sharing the Malaysian perspective, the regional perspective, and global perspective. I want to leave all of you here with a call to action that, ladies and gentlemen, we really live in a reality where climate change, rising inequality, poverty, and environmental degradation are real and compounding challenges. We have the urgency of the solutions at hand, and you've heard from our panelists that Asia represents a very, very important opportunity to invest for the solutions. So I really urge all of you to think about it and get involved, and really think about how do I invest today with the future in mind, and so that future generations can thrive. And with that, I'd like to invite you to thank all our panelists and look to engaging after this.